Welcome to NucleCast, the official podcast of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Each week, we bring you leading experts for a lively discussion on topics related to strategic nuclear deterrence. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, Director of Strategic Programs at the National Strategic Research Institute. The views of the hosts and the guests are their own.
We're back and you're listening to another great episode of NucleCast. Of course, I am your host, as always, Adam Lowther. And today we have with us somebody whom I've known for a very long time. Dr. Carl Rehberg, Air Force Colonel, retired, who is now, I met Carl when he was working on the air staff and stood up the China Studies group for a former chief. But he's now an assistant professor in the Graduate National Security Program at Liberty University, training our future national security leaders. And he's writing and thinking and getting quite a bit of work done. He's also happens to be a pretty good guy. Carl, thanks for coming on NucleCast to talk with us.
Thank you very much, Adam. That's very, very kind of you. And not to surprise you, but we have a good mutual friend that I certainly want to acknowledge, and that's Colonel retired, the late Christopher Wren, who was both a good friend of ours, who was a great man and defended this country honorably, and was my deputy in the Asia Pacific cell that I headed up for the Air Force for a number of years, and so I just want to acknowledge him. Both that's a mutual friend of both of ours.
Yeah, whenever I come to DC, I usually try to make a trip to go see him at Arlington. So it's well, at any rate. So Chris, we miss your brother, but we still have things to talk about. And so we're going to talk about, it's funny because you had reached out to me after listening to a previous episode that spurred you to want to discuss missile defense in the Asia Pacific, which is, as we shift to China and as we think about the possibility of a fight over Taiwan. And, the Chinese have to cover 160 kilometers of water, and we've got to cover 11,000, I think. It's quite a bit of a difference, and the Chinese have heavily invested in ballistic missiles, and they're investing in hypersonics. And it's a very clear threat, and it's one you've spent considerable time researching and writing about in your work. So can you just lay out for us and for the guests, what is the threat that the United States is going to face in the Pacific?
Thank you very much for that setup. And Adam, the bottom line is a lot of people have obviously been watching what China's been doing. And I would point people to a couple documents. Obviously, the annual China report that DoD puts out is probably the premier open source. And so I'm going to be quoting open source documents here. And then back in 2015, if people want to really see how this threat really morphed and really accelerated, is the RAND China scorecard. So if you Google RAND and China scorecard, it was actually written in 2015, but it basically gives a great picture of what the threat was in the late 90s, and then the early 2000s, and then around the 2015. And really what we've had an explosion, no pun intended, but really a breakout in missile production. And if you think about it, and so I'm paraphrasing what the annual China report says, the missile testing and the missile things that China does is more than the whole rest of the world combined. So think about that just for a second. That is is how big. And then here in the last couple of years, and I know this is close to your heart, China is involved in a nuclear breakout. Okay, let me repeat that: a nuclear breakout. I really would not have. So many people would not have expected this, but actually, we've had open source people talking about this for the last 2 years. Um, this is huge, and to be able to pull that portion off, as well as other aspects of what we call the PLA rocket force, which most of the capabilities are contained in. There's some in the services as well. That's just huge. And we really have not responded well to that threat. One area to, of course, respond to that is in missile defense. And again, the Chinese, unlike the Russians, have lots and lots of ballistic missiles, lots of different kinds. They have significantly more conventional ballistic missiles. So, unlike the war in Ukraine that people have watched, really the Soviets, or the Russians rather, their primary short-range ballistic missile used in the conflict was the SS-26 Stone. But the Chinese basically have so many different additional models and various kinds that really pales in comparison. But they also have a huge cruise missile threat that very few people have done a good job of acknowledging. You'll see some of my writings that have kind of made a clarion call on that. And then you throw out the new kind of leading edge, cutting edge threats that we're really concerned about, of course, is the hypersonics, whether that be with hypersonic cruise missiles or hypersonic glide vehicles that really, really difficult threats to get at. So that in a nutshell kind of gives you a panoply. But and then if you look on how we've responded, our response has been, pretty muted based on those huge changes over the last 20 years.
So let me ask you two questions then. The first one is, as we've watched Russia in Ukraine and we've watched their use of ballistic and cruise and hypersonic missiles, they have underperformed. And I wondered, and we got that wrong. We thought that their systems were better than they seem to have turned out to be. Do we have a good sense of the quality of the Chinese systems? That's question number one. And then question number two, do we have a good sense of tactically how the Chinese will employ their cruise and ballistic missiles and the targets they're going to strike?
So excellent questions. So obviously limited discussion open source on this. So, but you're right. I think we got some of the Russian threat wrong, although I am waiting for a full and complete report. A lot of lack of information on Russia, Ukraine, especially after the first 3 months. I wrote an article in June of 2022 and felt like we had a good amount of information on what was going on then. But I think since that time, the information is still lacking. But nevertheless, by all appearances, the Russian cruise missiles are not quite as good as what they were sold. I would say that the Chinese, I think, probably, even though they based a lot of their capabilities on Russian capabilities, if you recall some of the history on when Russia was there in the late 50s and 60s, before they had kind of the parting, before they rejoined here recently, they do a lot of testing. And that open source, Google, you can see they have actually simulated and set up bases. And you can go to Google and a number of open source articles where they've actually designed and replicated bases in Okinawa, bases in Japan, and they practice firings of these. And so I think their due diligence is good. Will it be up to what we So what's actually written? Likely not, but I would not get too confident that they're going to perform as poorly as the Russians. I just think that the Chinese have done some more due diligence, and they have so many other different systems. This is where the Russians, I think, fell short in a number of areas. Is they really didn't have the robust systems for this kind of conflict. Um, so anyway, hopefully that answers your question.
And so tactically, how do you see them employing their systems and going after what specifically?
Yeah. So again, no one can know exactly what their plans are, but I think we can see that clearly they're going to go after the key areas of our power projection. If you look at a number of publications, you know that the Chinese looked at the Gulf War II, Desert Shield, Desert Storm very carefully, and they have a plan. It's called a counter intervention plan. We call it A2AD, anti access and aerial denial. And so their plan is to keep us from coming in, to help anyone. So that's number one. Number two, the fact that when I go and look at the Google pictures, I see that they have ports that they are simulating attacking. So key ports that we have for the Navy. That they are, they also have simulations of air bases that they're planning on attacking, as well as Army integrated air missile defense sites. So all those are obviously likely targets for the U.S. Obviously, we've been talking about Taiwan. They probably have a whole target set there as well. But those are the main. So they're going after our power projection and our ability to flow forces in, because what we have done over the last 20, 30 years is um, follow a philosophy that will just flow in forces and take care of our adversaries. China has thought through that much more carefully, and that's why posture and presence and missile defense is so much more important um, today than it has been in the past.
Well, so that brings up a sort of a follow-on question, and that is, do we have adequate defenses for Guam, for bases in Japan, for our Korea, for all of our assets and in the region? Are we defending them? Because we don't defend the homeland. We assume the homeland is safe. Are we defending our forward-based forces?
Mm-hmm. So here's the way I would say that. So looking at it from an open source perspective, we look at our posture and presence of missile defense. So right now, open source, we have one THAAD battery at Guam, and that's it. So obviously, the defense of Guam, we're moving toward doing that. But if you look at Okinawa, we have some Patriot capabilities, some PAC-3 capabilities in the Kadena area, and then also on the main island of Japan. And then if you look at Korea, we obviously have some capabilities there. So the short answer is currently the current presence and posture is not adequate to do the kind of defense that we need for both our ports, for our air bases, and then other critical assets that we need to protect that would be on what we call a defended asset list.
So they're doing some work in Guam to shore up defenses there. Can you talk about, the experimentation, the ideas, the systems that are going on that we're employing there? And is that something that we can grow to be an adequate defense of Guam?
So again, a lot of open sources come out on this. The original idea on defending Guam really came out of a George Bush policy directive, I believe is in 2004, that said we needed to start defending our forward deployed forces. The first, other than the THAAD battery, which again, open source now says that we were primarily, the THAAD battery there is primarily against a North Korean threat. But early in January 2020, PACOM commander basically suggested that we put an Aegis ashore capability, which is, again, keep in mind the Navy is probably the best service, likely I would argue the best service in the world for a layered, comprehensive, integrated air missile defense. And I think you've had previous guests that have talked to Aegis and their capabilities. And so originally we were going to put an Aegis ashore like we're doing in Romania and Poland. But since then, other folks have looked at the problem and said, hey, we've got some other issues. And so what's essentially evolved is a combination of Aegis ashore and using Army systems, THAAD, likely PAC-3s, and then the area where we still have somewhat of a question mark is what we're going to do in cruise missile defense. But the bottom line is the foundation and the core are going to be linked to the SM-6 missile, which is one of the better missiles out there, and the SM-3. If you've been following the SM-3 Block 1 and the Block 2s, which just been phenomenal, those are critical. So yes, Guam, even as planned, and what we know open source, will be one of the most defended places that the U.S. has. The question is whether or not we will be able to do that in a timely fashion and what the cost will be. Those have been some recent concerns that have developed over the last year. And happy to talk to some follow-up questions on that.
Well, we're at that time of the show where we have to take a quick break. But when we come back, I want to ask you if you think we have the ability to expand our defenses prior to, what General Minahan and, we've seen some others who have suggested 2026, 2027 might be a time frame where Taiwan comes under attack from the Chinese. So when we get back, I want you to answer that question. You're listening to NucleCast, and we'll be right back. This episode of NucleCast is brought to you by the ANWA Deterrence Center, whose mission is to educate Americans about the nuclear enterprise and strategic deterrence. We're back and we're talking to Carl Rehberg, and we've been having a great discussion about ballistic missile defenses in the Asia Pacific. So before the break, I asked you to think about the timing and can we get these defensive systems in place prior to an expected 2026, 2027 attack by the Chinese on Taiwan. Can we do that?
Yes, I think we're capable. The plan that we have right now, though, is slipping to the right. And the area that's slipping to the right that is most concerning, that may be is technically easier to do, but we seem to have had a problem, is the cruise missile portion. So keep in mind, we have to protect against ballistic missiles. We have to protect against cruise missiles. We have to protect against a 360-degree attack. We also have to think about hypersonic cruise missiles, hypersonic, other hypersonic weapons, whether they be hypersonic glide vehicles. And then what's really, I think, opened our eyes with the Russia-Ukraine is the fact that we've seen not only in Russia-Ukraine, but in other places where you could have a combined attack where you could have drones that could come in and take out some of the IMD assets prior. So yes, we have the capability of getting some capability within the time frame, but right now the cruise missile defense portion seems to be lacking, and that's so there's a number of experts that have talked to that in the last couple months, open source. Primarily because it looks like we're relying mostly on the Army's IFPC Increment 2, that's the indirect fire protection capability, which uses the AIM-9X Block 2 primarily for cruise missile defense. That has recently slipped to the right again, and whether or not we're going to be able to get there and get that capability on island in time in sufficient numbers right now is a question mark. And again, we've had some articles just recently come up here in the last 2 weeks on that.
Now, I don't claim to be an expert on ballistic missile defenses and cruise missile defenses, but I think back, I was on board the USS Ramage, and we had the CWIS, close-in weapon systems, and it's a 20 millimeter depleted uranium rounds, basically shot out of a Gatling gun that, it acquires targets, shoots them, reacquires them. And I remember doing tests down off of Vieques, and we would, an Air Force aircraft was pulling a drone, and we had to, target the drone and take it out. And the CWIS was on auto, and it shot down the drone, and then it saw the tow cable, and then it started, moving up the tow cable toward the aircraft. And that pilot was not happy with that. So we had to, turn off the CWIS mount. But I never hear about systems like that. It's always sort of much higher end systems that, we're looking at shooting down cruise, ballistic drone, are things like CWIS, whatever its current iteration is, and other sort of less expensive capabilities out there to do some of this work to defend bases and assets?
Yes, and so the really, really important point that you bring up, the importance of having both a layered defense and then also having a low-cost defense, especially against the threats that are really not complicated. The CWIS is a great weapon for the Navy. Again, the Army has taken that and put that on a truck. They call that LAWS, and so other folks have actually looked at that as a possibility. It gets a little bit dicey with the number of personnel either at a port or at an air base with the shells. But I will tell you there's a number of other guns that are coming out. One is called hypervelocity projectiles, HVPs. And there are several companies and several organizations working on HVP capability. And looking at iterations where essentially you would have a guided round hit a cruise missile or other types of things. So that needs to be in the mix. Directed energy also needs to be in the mix as well because of the need, and especially as we found out, we have a munitions shortfall. And anytime you have to rely on munitions, you have a finite number and you can only produce so many and have so many in stock. And so directed energy also would play a role in this. But you're absolutely right. The gun aspects, there are a variety of ones, I think, that go beyond CWIS that we're looking at least in a ground-based defense. I still think the CWIS is a great system for the Navy. Some have looked at the CWIS and essentially gone in some other directions. So several contractors looking at different gun systems.
And is there a sense of urgency? Because I'm not sure. My great fear is that the fight comes before we have all these great plans. We recognize the threat. We were slowly but surely moving out, but then the fight comes well ahead of time. And then that's not a fight we win if we're not ready. So do we have the urgency that is required?
I think we have. So the PACOM commander has certainly made the defense of Guam urgent. What I have suggested in some of my writings, in some of my papers, is we already need to be looking beyond the defense of Guam, and we need to be doing the defense of Guam equivalent on the first island chain and working with the Japanese. And this would pay huge dividends because we have to essentially look at the first island chain. Again, the Japanese bring a lot of integrated air missile defense capability to the table. We need to be integrating U.S. capabilities with Japanese capabilities. Again, some of that work is ongoing, but I think more needs to be done. And I think we need the equivalent of a defense of Guam on some of the main islands of Japan and likely Okinawa. So that's where I think a sense of urgency needs to. So we need to be thinking already about, okay, what do we do after defense of Guam? How are we going to protect our allies? And the only way we're going to do that is working together with the Japanese self-defense forces and us as one of our key allies in the region, but Australia and others would also play a role. So sense of urgency is ongoing in Guam. We need a sense of urgency that goes beyond the defense of Guam, in my opinion.
Now, I don't know if you knew this, Carl, but I've started bringing my magic lamp. I didn't know if you knew I had one, but I do have one. And I've been letting guests on the episode make 3 wishes after rubbing my magic lamp. So I'm going to let you do the same thing. And so now that you get to make 3 wishes as you think about, missile defense and in the Asia Pacific, what are those 3 wishes?
Yeah. So one of the 3 wishes is all the services need to step up and do missile defense. So it can't just be the Army, it can't just be the Navy. And heretofore, the Air Force has been focused mostly on space capabilities and some air capabilities. All 3 need to be upping their game. The Army needs to basically increase its capabilities as well as its capacity, but the Air Force needs to step in. But then we also need to be integrating with our closest allies, and we need to go beyond the second island chain and be looking also at the first island chain. And then my third area is, again, we focus a lot on active defenses, but I'll bring out this term and I'll go ahead and quote the 2018 NDS. Is we need to be looking at missile defense holistically. It is active defenses, passive defenses, and then I'm going to use a word called counterstrike. That's not in with the U.S. doctrine, but that deals with basically taking out the archers. So that basically means power projection and the capability of taking out, whether it's a bomber that's going to launch cruise missiles at Guam, we need to take out the bomber before it launches the cruise missiles instead of taking out all the cruise missiles. If you've been following Japan, Japan had a huge development in December where they had their first national defense strategy. And they are moving into what they call counterstrike, which means that they are going to do offensive capabilities after they have been struck. And so that's what we call counterstrike. And so the Japanese are moving in that area. We need to help them. So that's my third wish, is we need to help them because our actual offensive power projection capabilities are actually pretty limited when you look at a posture and presence in the Pacific right now. And really the plans, at least open source, don't show much improvement for us in that regard.
Let me ask one final question as we come to an end in this show. And that, as I think about it, I sort of wonder and worry about the ability to defend. Is it, it's sort of that, is the best defense a good offense? Or, do we just defend long enough to not see our assets wiped out, and we can then, get them up in the air, get them out to sea? Because I can easily see a large scale missile attack from the Chinese that targets, because you can argue that the Japanese Navy is probably the second best Navy in the world. So they would take them out, maybe potentially take out the Korean Navy. They've got some great ships. And in that sort of initial opening attack, that we see large scale decimation, and that it's just too hard to defend against it. Can you maybe talk about that for a second? Can we really defend it, or do we need to be on alert? Do we need to be dispersing forces? Where are we?
Yeah, so we need to be doing all the above. And so part of that, and I mentioned, is so when we look at integrated air missile defense comprehensively, we also have to look at the passive defenses. So we have to also look at hardening. We have to look at dispersal. And I would argue we need to bring back some constructs. So not to make this a Cold War, but some constructs where you have different forces on different levels of alert, and sometimes you would disperse those forces. And so all those constructs should be on the table. And so we have a menu out there. We just have to basically use some of those aspects on the menu. The fact remains is Japan can't come to the CONUS. So again, we have some abilities to maybe not put as many forces forward, but at the same token, we have our closest allies that are also sitting there in that. And so there's some ways to do that, to be able to reconstitute, but we should be looking at, again, all three areas. We should be looking at active defenses, passive defenses, and counter-strike, what we call posture resiliency. And so that involves a lot of things. What the Marines are doing is EABO, Expeditionary Air Base Operations, and then what the Air Force is doing is what they call Agile Combat Employment, ACE. And those have to do with dispersal. All those concepts need to be accelerated, and we need to get down to business.
Carl Rehberg, thanks for joining us on this episode of NucleCast. And I want to thank you, the list. Yeah, it was great to see you. Great to have you on the show. It's it's good to see you're still actively engaged and thinking and pushing the ideas that I think for many of the listeners are important and important for the national security. Thanks to you, the listeners, as well, and we will see you on the next episode of NucleCast. Well, and that conversation with Carl, I definitely have some afterthoughts. It is a complex problem trying to defend Guam, Japan, Korea, forces in Okinawa, it's Japan, but, defending our assets in the Asia Pacific against a Chinese threat that is expansive. And I thought Carl did a great job of explaining that threat. And, when we ended the show, he brought up several other points in regard to Chinese capabilities and what we do and don't know. So I think we'll have to have him back to discuss Chinese capabilities specifically, because they have such a breadth of options to use against the U.S. And they've been thinking about us for 30 years. And they've been planning and building for this capability, and we have not effectively responded because we thought they'd become a democracy. So we're now behind. So it was a great talk. I enjoyed it. Hopefully you did as well.
This has been a production of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Our executive producer is Kimberly Charrington, and this episode has been engineered and mixed by David Krumthal. Follow the show on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at NucleCast. Listen, follow, and review the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.